Government is inherently bogus in every way. However, there are differences between governments about how bogus they are and how much they violate individual rights. Every government steals and assaults and does nasty, immoral, illegitimate things, but they do it to different degrees. And if you look into like the debates between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists among the founding fathers of the United States, there's a bunch of concepts and issues being thrown around back and forth, and people have been philosophizing about these things many hundreds or even thousands of years before that. But there are a number of principles that actually matter as just concepts in and of themselves, aside from politics and government and all that stuff. But I want to talk about something that, there's 8 zillion things that government does that somebody comes out and says, this is the end of the world. If we let them get away with this, well, then it's just total totalitarianism and everything's doomed. And I don't jump on those bandwagons very often, because I usually think, well, it's just one more tiny little bit of what they've always done. Yeah, it's bad, and yeah, it's horrendous and not okay and immoral and intolerable and all that fun stuff. But it's still just more of the same. And alarmists tend to think, well, this one piece of legislation, if this happens, then everything's over, because that's blah, blah, blah. And I usually just think, well, whatever, those things are par for the course. But I want to point out something that really is creepy and really is a significant jump towards outright fascism and totalitarianism that we may be very close to seeing in the United States, which is going to result in either massive oppression or massive violent resistance, or both, probably both, unless it doesn't happen, unless the legislators are smart enough to back off. I don't mean smart enough to do the right thing for the sake of virtue and righteousness. Legislators don't ever do that. They are professional parasites and thugs. I mean smart enough to back off before they get themselves killed, because they're going to do something that steps over a line too far that will actually trigger a number of people to forcibly resist. And this time it's being helped by none other than the Orange Führer, Donald Trump, who, it's just, of all the stupid things he said, of all the pro-authoritarian garbage he's promoted, this one stands out to me as more important, even though it doesn't get talked about any more than a bunch of his other stupid gaffes and stuff, which is the concept of due process. Now, of course, within politics, due process still means within the game of law and legislation, and it's still bogus when government does it. But if you imagine a world without government, there's still a reason for the concept of due process, whether you call it that or not. Let's say you hear a rumor that, hey, your neighbor beats his wife. If you say, well, I'm going to go punch him out or something, without checking to see if that's actually true, if you just blindly believe it because somebody else says it, you may be doing a bigger injustice by righteously charging in, and then you find out, oh, no, he does nothing of the sort. Someone who doesn't like him started a rumor about them. And that's why the concept of due process, completely aside from political and legislative garbage, is actually rational. It's like, well, let's make sure we know what is actually true and what's actually justified before we go, punish somebody or hurt somebody or do something rash, and then find out, oops, we should have been more careful. So, and there are a number of things like that that are principles that even in courts have been, sort of laid down in the law for a gazillion years that actually have a rational basis underneath them. And then, of course, they get corrupted and mangled into statist garbage. But the concept of due process, and that's sort of linked to innocent until proven guilty, because those go together, and somebody having a right to confront his accusers. Again, I'm not even talking about the legal stuff and the constitutional stuff. Just if somebody's accused of something, they ought to have the right to say, wait, I didn't do that, and look, I can prove, the right to defend yourself and the right to present evidence. It's sort of all one general concept of due process, and that's the point of a right to a trial by jury. Now, of course, when government says that, they mean within the context of government courts and stuff, and then the government cheats around that all over the place too. But the idea of, all right, I'm not just gonna hear some rumor and attack somebody. Like, I want a bunch of people to consider the evidence and say what they think, and are we really sure this guy did something before we're gonna retaliate or punish him or go do something, because we don't want to harm the innocent. I mean, that's the whole freaking point of due process, and the right to not be forced to testify against yourself, and the right to be able to defend yourself and confront your accusers, and all that stuff is just so innocent people don't get hurt. And we would still want that without a government. It wouldn't look the same. It wouldn't be a guy in a black dress behind a big wooden desk declaring what the law is, but the principles still make sense. And when a government throws away some of these fundamental principles, you better start being scared. And I don't usually do this. I don't usually do the fear-mongering thing of, oh, this little, like, they banned high-capacity magazines, this is the end of the world. It's like, no, that's just more of the same. I'm talking mainly about the red flag laws as one big example, and it's something that the Orange Fuhrer is all in favor of. I want to take guns first, go through due process second. That's what he said. And that is scarier than anything I've ever heard a Democratic president say. Now, most Democratic presidents, I mean, they're all slimy, power-happy crooks, but at least they're smart enough to hide their slimy, power-happy selves under nice-sounding rhetoric and that, whereas Donald Trump just blurts out his fascism for all to see. But when he says, oh, I'll take the guns first, go through due process later, that concept, that principle in general, to those who understand the philosophy and the ideas behind it, should scare the hell out of you. Because what that means, and it's already happening, there are already states making these red flag laws. There was already somebody who died in, I think it was Maryland, because the police went and said, well, we have this piece of paper that says we get to disarm you because we're concerned that you're a threat to somebody or other. When power becomes arbitrary, it's time to worry. And what I mean by that is they don't have to prove something. Like under the Constitution, and again, the government doesn't even abide by the Constitution, but under the Constitution, they're not supposed to punish you for something they just guess maybe you did. There's the whole thing of burden of proof, and you have a right to a trial, and you have to be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury of your peers. And no, that's not how it actually works, but in theory, that's the express design of the Constitution, which has been thrown out the window. But that idea that you don't get to just punish somebody and harm somebody based on a hunch or somebody's say-so or an assertion or whatever, you really need to prove that it's justified before you go do this to somebody. And to throw that away really is the final step to totalitarianism. Because if you get to a point where any cop can, like, either, well, some anonymous person said, you're kind of scary, so I'm going to come to your house with a bunch of my fellow thugs with guns and kick down your door and disarm you because we're scared you might be a threat to somebody. Don't have to prove it. Don't have to take you to court first. Don't have to present evidence. We just have to say we're concerned. That should scare the crap out of you, because that is the final step to totalitarianism, where every thug with a badge can on his own arbitrarily decide to do whatever the hell he wants to and say, well, I was concerned. And there were already a lot of examples of that. You know, there are already cops who are like, I feared for my safety, so he shot him and 2 of his neighbors and 3 of his dogs. And like, they already do whatever the hell they want and get away with it a lot. But to codify that into law and say, well, if we're concerned, then we get to disarm you. And another example of what Trump said is, he said, and this was a while ago, he said that he thinks that anybody on the no-fly list shouldn't be allowed to get a gun. The no-fly list, for those who don't know, you can get put on that for a clerical error or a whim. They don't prove anything. They don't say, here's the case against you and here's your chance to rebut it. They just stick you on the list. And you may just find yourself on the list and go, well, how did I get there and what do I do about it? Well, you got there because somebody somewhere through a process you don't get to know about, based on evidence or a whim that you don't get to know about, put you on that list. And for Trump to say he doesn't think people on that list should be allowed to have a gun is for him to all the way say, on a whim, government should be able to just decide, you don't get to be armed, you don't get to be armed, you don't get to be armed. We don't have to argue anything, we don't have to prove anything, we don't take it to trial. We just put you on this list, and based on the list that we just made up, we're going to violently attack you if you try to possess a firearm. That is what he openly advocated, and he did that a while ago, even before his just fascist comments about, I think we go through, due process second. First, take the guns. I want to take the guns early. He said it in public, on TV, right on camera. And that as a principle, there's a whole bunch of individual violations of rights that government always does, Republican, Democrat, everything in between. But this as a principle really should scare the hell out of you. Because if it comes to the point where government can just say, well, we looked at your Facebook and you don't seem to like cops, so we're sending a bunch of cops to your house to kick down your door and take your guns away because we deem that you're a threat. That is the last step towards totalitarianism, because the totalitarian part means total control. And if you give every thug the discretion to just make stuff up and do whatever the hell he wants and barge into your house and disarm you or arrest you or whatever it is, that is the end. That's the end of even the facade of the rule of law. We can make it up and later we'll find some justification to say it was okay, but we can do whatever the hell we want with you and to you based on something we just decided on a whim. And if for people who don't understand the principles and the concepts and the philosophy underlying this, if they just think, well, that's just for crazy people, they'll only use that for if there's some crazy person and then they need to take his guns. If you actually believe that giving government arbitrary power to do something like this is only going to be used in cases where it's justified, read a freaking history book. This is how every single totalitarian regime happened, is they put it into law and said, well, if somebody's this kind of threat, then we can spy on them and search them and kick down the door and drag them away and put them in prison because they're an enemy of the state. I believe, I should have tried to find this quote before I started this rant. I believe that Trump even said something about anybody who's an enemy of the state shouldn't be allowed to have a gun. I am an enemy of the state. Absolutely, I admit it. I'm not a terrorist. I don't shoot people. I haven't done anything violent. But I am absolutely an enemy of the state because the state is always an enemy of freedom and justice. What it does is violate individual rights, violently control people, and rob people. I'm against that, which means I am anti-government. I am an enemy of the state. According to Trump's vague, blurted out fascist BS, he doesn't think I should be armed because I don't like government aggression. And that should scare the hell out of you. And anybody paying attention who actually thinks about these concepts philosophically and actually understands the underlying principles of due process and all that stuff, this should scare you more than any of the individual dumb little incursions on freedom that government does. Because if this goes through, if the state and federal governments adopt the idea of, hey, if we're concerned about you, we can do whatever the hell we want to you, including kicking down your door and disarming you or arresting you, and then later we'll see if we can prove something against you. That is the last step to an absolute police state. And I'm also going to end by throwing out this warning. There are enough people in the U.S., and I'm one of them, who will not go quietly if this happens. And that means there will be cops dying. If cops show up at my house and say, we're taking away your guns because we don't like some of the opinions you expressed on Facebook or wherever. And I don't mean threats and threatening to bomb something because I don't do any of that. But if they just don't like the fact that I'm very critical of government and that I actually support the idea of defensive force against any aggressor, including an aggressor with a badge, if they decide, well, we don't really like your opinion, we're going to come to your house and forcibly disarm you, I believe I have the absolute moral right to use any means necessary, including deadly force, to stop them from doing that. And I am far, far from being the only one who thinks that, including a bunch of people who aren't even voluntarists. There's a bunch of constitutionalists and minarchists and stuff who believe the same, and just a bunch of conservatives and Republicans that you don't just get to disarm me because you don't like some opinion I had somewhere. If they step over this line, it's going to be scary, one, because that's basically there is no distinction between us and a complete totalitarian police state if they have that much arbitrary power. And two, there are enough people that they're going to shoot back, and you're going to start seeing piles of dead cops if the police are stupid enough to try to enforce this crap. So far, they have been stupid and evil enough to try to enforce this crap. There have been a couple little stories already of it being carried out. One in Maryland where they killed a guy who didn't want to be disarmed based on this red flag warning. And the media has been very vague and weird about the specifics of why did you do that to that guy in the beginning? Like, why was this justified to begin with? And they don't really like to talk about it. But for all the dumb little examples of government doing evil shit, this should scare the crap out of you. And I rarely say that, because normally it's just one more example. The idea of police and government having this power where, some anonymous person said they were scared of you, so we're going to come barge into your house pointing machine guns in your face, that really is a fundamental change. And if that happens, a lot is going to happen that will be very scary and very ugly and very bad. I am not one to tell you to write your congressman and tell them to please vote against blah, 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 blah. I will say, I think it's good to publicly express that if you think cops are going to go to people's houses and say, on a whim or some anonymous tip or something, we're going to violently disarm you, people have the absolute right to shoot the people who show up at their house to do that. Absolutely. Is it a good idea on practical terms? No, they'll probably die in the process. But if we have become a people that are going to quietly allow that to happen and then whine about it after the fact, then we have become a people that deserve to be oppressed by a totalitarian police state.